Hello and welcome to another Ease Live tutorial. In today's video, I'm going to talk about grid layers, which are a really fun feature of Ease Live, a very powerful feature for when you want to render a list of items, for example, a league table, or like we have set up today, a very simple example. In today's program, I would like to show a list of segments in this imaginary broadcast that I'm designing a package for. So our starting point here is a simple scene. It has that single row. I've also created an event called schedule. There's no data properties yet on that event. And under triggers here, you can see I've selected it to show and hide this scene when this event is taken on and off air. The basics of events have been covered in a previous video. So if this is all new to you, I recommend maybe watching that first. But in any case, hopefully the grid specific stuff should make sense to you either way. So let's dive right in. In Cockpit here, I have opened our little project, our sample program. And you'll see we have a schedule event. I can take it on air. It shows our scene, all well and good. But we need to be able to input some data here, a list of segments, a time and a title for each. And we would like to show them in a tidy little list. So your first instinct might be to go, okay, we need multiple items. Let me duplicate and just make a bunch of items like this. But then you'll quickly find that setting this up with all the data overrides for each of these, hooking data from the cockpit into here is quite tedious. And also in doing it this way, you now have a static number of items. You don't have the freedom to let the producer enter as many items as they want and just have the list adapt. And also, if you were to want to animate these, as we are going to do later on in this video, you'll find that it would be a lot of work to sort of individually animate each of these items. So this is where grids come in and where their power lies. So let's go ahead and add a grid layer. A grid layer is a special type of layer that simply takes a list of data, which it will set up in a moment. And for each item in that list, it will render a component, a duplicate of a component, and it will render it as many times as needed to show all the data, essentially. So let's go ahead and convert this row layer into a component so we can use it for our grid layer. We can do that by right-clicking, choosing convert to component here. If we didn't have this already sort of made, we could also click this little plus icon up here to create a new component. But we already have it, so there we go. A component. Double clicking that, we can confirm it is here. Oh, let me just clear that up from a previous attempt at this video. And we will pin it to the edges. There we go, just out of principle, so that whatever size this component is used at, it stretches to fill the whole component. All right, and we have our time and title. So back to our scene, back to our grid. We can now choose this row. We can choose the direction. We can choose how they should be distributed within the grid. But let's go ahead and increase the count so we see what happens here. And you'll notice we now have 4 items here. We don't have any manually added layers here. It's just a single grid layer, and it handles the rendering of the components for us. So let's go ahead and delete this single row item and replace it with this grid. We'll move it over to where that was. Let's say, was it 298? I believe the size was. All right, and let's clear the background as well. And we can also, down in this grid section here, or below the grid section, we have this spacing section. Let's go ahead and add a tiny bit of gutter so we get some separation between them. And then we will get to the grid reveal and grid hide in a moment. So far so good. We have a list, but we don't have the data for it. So let's set that up next. We want the producer to be able to enter a list of segments. So in the event here, we will, rather than just a simple sort of text property like we have looked at in previous videos, we will add a list. And we'll call that segments. Now we could just go ahead and add a single text field here, call it title, just show you what that looks like, we will save and refresh. And now you'll notice that we have the segments list here, and we can add items with a single sort of input for the title of each item. But we also want a time. So first of all, let's go ahead and stop that. We'll just clear this for now, clear the rundown. And then we will remove this. And instead, we want each item in this list to be a group. Call it an item, for example. And each one will have two text fields, a title and a time. And we can also set the minimum and maximum amount of items in a list. Let's say we always want at least 3, and we'll cap it at 5. You can just leave it open, but just for the sake of demonstration, we'll do that now. And now if we refresh, we will see that we have our schedule event, and under segments, we have items, at least 3, we can add more. We can also delete items and shuffle them around. And now we see each item has a title and a time. Okay, awesome. So let's enter a title and a time for each one. At noon, call it hello. Let's imagine this is a short program. Hello again. And then at 12:40, wrapping up. Okay, now if we air this, you'll notice that nothing really is happening here, or we have entered the data, but we haven't actually hooked it up to our grid yet. So let's do that next. Let's go back to our scene, go to our grid layer, and there's a field here called list source under the grid section. The list source is the data that you want to feed into the grid. In this case, we want to feed our segments into the grid. And what that's going to do is for each of the items in the segments list, it's going to render one row here. But we also want to be able to enter the time and title for each item, of course. So let's go ahead and set that up in our component. A component needs to have properties defined in order to receive data. If you have experience with front-end development, you will be very comfortable with the concept of components and their properties. If you are used to design tools like Sketch, for example, you might know symbols and overrides. The major difference between this and a sort of sketching program like Sketch or Figma is that here you are not limited in terms of what you can override. A complex component can have, dozens of layers, and each layer can have data overrides for the width, the text, the color. It could be anything, including animations. They can have overrides as well. So rather than having sort of predefined fields when you're using a component for what you can override, you can set your own properties here so that you are in complete control over what data a component receives and how it is applied to your layers. So let's add a title property. We are telling EaseLive that this component, every time it is used, should be able to receive a title and a time, which is also some text, because then we can just enter the formatting as we like it in Cockpit. Hit save. There we go. And now on our text layers, all we have to do is, just like the data overrides we have seen before from using text from an event directly, we now have the properties listed here that we just defined for this component. So these are this is internal data for this component. And the title should be whatever it receives for the title field, and the time layer should use the time text. And now, going back to our scene, we will notice that under the grid layer, there's a new section called component properties, and we can see we have inputs for the time and title. We have already told EaseLive that the data should be coming from the segments list. So now we just tell it that the title for each row should be from the segments list. For each item, we want to use the title input from our event. I know this is a lot to keep track of, but hopefully you are able to follow. We can review at the end all the pieces that fit together here. So again, from the schedule for each segment, or for from the segments list for each item, we want to grab the time. And that should be it. We go ahead and save. We refresh in Cockpit. There we go. Oh, I believe I've either hooked something up wrong or I've typed it in wrong here. Oh yeah, I've mixed up the title and time. All right, so consistency is key when ordering these fields, of course, but let's just go ahead and quickly fix that. Okay, we can just save changes here and refresh rather than airing a new event, just so we don't get a cluttered rundown. There we go. Hello, hello again. Wrapping up. And now, as we can see, if we go and add another item, call this, no, seriously, oh, seriously, goodbye, at 12:55, we air an update, we see another item appears. So magic, we have a list where you can add items, you can move them around, you can remove items, and the grid layer makes sure to render exactly one item or one row per item, and it maps up the data exactly as expected. Cool. Now, finally, of course, now we take this on and off air. You know, it goes on and off, but it doesn't look very interesting. So let's go ahead and animate this list, because that is the really fun part of grids. We have two sections here, one called grid reveal, one called grid hide, which, as you might imagine, if we add a value for stagger, let's kind of add a slightly exaggerated stagger here. It will render them sequentially rather than all at the same time. So if we go ahead and refresh, there we go. That was a little bit quick maybe for a video, but let's just show that again. You can see they kind of come in and out sequentially. All well and good. Now let's actually animate them. You'll notice that there's no animation options here directly under grid reveal and grid hide, and that is because you are not limited to simple animations here. What this does is it renders the component sequentially, meaning when the component is rendered, it will fire its show animation and hide animation when it's hidden. Which means that we can do anything here that we would do with a scene or any other animation. So just to illustrate, let's go ahead and let's flip it just for fun, from sort of minus 90 degrees to 0. So it kind of comes from being hidden to facing forward. We can even add a fade in, why not? A little bit faster is nice. And on hide, we will just flip it back, because this is a fun preset to work with. And we will also fade it back out. So now we have a show and a hide. And this animation will fire for each item in the list if we go ahead and refresh. And then we air it again. There we go. A nice little sort of flippy transition. So as you can see, you have the flexibility to do anything you want in these animations. You can even, animations can even trigger other components inside this component, which we'll cover in a future video. But you really are only limited by your imagination here in terms of how you render lists in and out. And as you can see, you don't need to do much here to make it work. You can go back here, you can tweak the stagger, you can maybe if you want it faster, you can iterate really fast on this. Go ahead and refresh. There you go. So a very, very quick way to achieve really cool effects using dynamic data from Cockpit or any other data source. We can cover doing the same thing with API sources in a future video, but for now, that is grid basics.